The key takeaway is that Jesus is the founder of the movement that bears his name, not Paul. And that's why it really is Christianity and not Paulianity. Did Paul invent Christianity? Well, that's the charge from a bunch of Christianity's critics. That Paul of Tarsus, the former persecutor of the early church turned apostle to the Gentiles, he simply got the gospel wrong, with Paul's aberrant teaching winning out in the first century against the true message of Jesus, such that Pauline Christianity is responsible for the religion we know today. Now, this criticism takes various forms. Mythicists obviously don't believe there was a historical Jesus, and they say that Paul invented Christianity wholesale, based off visions of a heavenly figure. Muslims, on the other hand, they do believe there was a real Jesus, who they call Isa, but they claim he was a prophet of Islam. They argue then that Paul invented Christianity by corrupting the true Injil, the gospel, blasphemously elevating Jesus to a divine status as the Son of God who offers salvation from sin. But Judaizers, they're the ones that no doubt have the dominant expression of this charge that Paul invented Christianity. They argue that Jesus' role as the Jewish Messiah was to restore devotion to Torah, and that Paul's gospel to the Gentiles, that salvation is by grace alone through faith alone, and that you don't need to follow Torah in order to follow Jesus, they say that's a dangerous perversion. So what does the Christian story say about whether Paul got Jesus wrong? Did Paul invent Christianity? Well, let me say three things. First, Christianity undoubtedly predates Paul. Even though Paul's letters in the New Testament are our earliest Christian writings, there is ample evidence that Paul's conversion to Christianity came after he was already persecuting the first followers of Jesus. Several places in his own letters, Paul admits the embarrassing story of his violence in trying to stamp out the early church. 1 Corinthians 15:9, Galatians 1:13 and 23, Philippians 3:6, and 1 Timothy 1:13. Now, Christianity must already exist for Paul to persecute Christians, so logically speaking, Christianity cannot be of Paul's making. And in case you're worried that Paul simply invented the persecution story, the book of Acts, an early chronicle of the church's history, it confirms not only Paul's story, but also details the prior history of the church in the years leading up to Paul's persecutions. So the claim that Paul invented Christianity wholesale, it just doesn't fly chronologically. But as for whether Paul got Jesus right, or whether he successfully colonized or corrupted the early followers of Jesus with another gospel, for that we need to dig deeper. Which is why, second, Paul's gospel was endorsed by Jesus' apostles. Even if you are dubious about who really penned 2 Peter, where in chapter 3 Peter seemingly elevates Paul's letters to the authority of Scripture, the book of Acts recounts how Paul became acquainted with the Jerusalem apostles, and how his gospel to the Gentiles was officially endorsed by the Council of Jerusalem, circa 50 AD. That means James, Jesus' brother, and Peter, the spokesperson for Jesus' apostles, both legitimize Paul's preaching. After all, critical scholars trace Paul's gospel in 1 Corinthians 15 to an early Christian creedal tradition that Paul received after his conversion. Paul even recounts how this happened in Galatians 1, where after downloading his gospel by revelation directly from Jesus, he traveled 3 years later to meet with Peter and James in Jerusalem, where he received the eyewitness traditions and gained their endorsement for the alignment of his gospel with their preaching. And even if you think Paul's letters are deceitful, and that the book of Acts is biased in Paul's favor, you have to remember that Paul was martyred in the mid to late 60s AD, and was outlived by some of Jesus' own apostles, most notably John, the son of Zebedee. If there were any red flags the apostles had about the contents of Paul's gospel, when they had the floor to speak, the truth is they remained silent. Even the next generation of church fathers, people like Clement of Rome and Ignatius, Polycarp and Papias, who were directly acquainted with the preaching and leadership of Jesus' apostles, especially Peter and John, they didn't voice any dissent to the influence of Paul's ministry. None. So with only positive evidence of apostolic endorsement of Paul's ministry and absolute silence when it comes to any apostolic dissent, especially when the apostles were already vocal about other false teachers, the testimony of history is that the apostles thought Paul got Jesus right in his preaching to the Gentiles. Which leads to third, Paul is surprisingly aligned with Jesus' teaching. Critics speak of a chasm between the kingdom teaching of Jesus in the Gospels and the gospel of salvation in Paul's epistles. And there are some differences to discuss. But in his book, Did St. Paul Get Jesus Right?, Oxford scholar David Wenham catalogues how often Paul draws directly from Jesus' teachings. In 1 Corinthians 11, Paul quotes the tradition of Luke's gospel about Jesus' last meal with his disciples, and how Jesus imbued the bread and wine of the Passover meal with new meaning as symbols of the new covenant. Here, Paul isn't just quoting Jesus directly. He's receiving the basis of his gospel of salvation, namely substitutionary atonement and the forgiveness of sins, from the theology of Jesus himself. In 1 Corinthians 15, Paul is expressly interested in the historical nature of the resurrection of Jesus and its implications, drawing from Jesus' own teaching about what his resurrection would mean for those who believe in him. In 1 Corinthians 7, in his teachings on marriage, singleness, divorce, and sex, Paul switches between Jesus' teaching, which he draws on as authoritative, likely drawn from the tradition incorporated into Matthew 19 and 22, and then his own thoughts on the subject. Further in Galatians and Romans, Paul speaks of God the Father using the familial term taught by Jesus to his disciples, Abba. And in 1 Thessalonians 4, Paul describes the return of Jesus with ideas mirroring his own teaching in Matthew 24, likely with his thief in the night reference to Jesus' parable. And to round this off, in 1 Timothy 5:18, Paul may even be quoting Jesus from Luke 10:7 on the worker being worth his wages. So from the application of Jesus' ethics to his churches, to the articulation of core doctrines like the incarnation, atoning death, and resurrection of Jesus, Paul is surprisingly aligned with the teaching of Jesus himself, especially considering he was never present during Jesus' earthly ministry. The key takeaway is that Jesus is the founder of the movement that bears his name, not Paul. And that's why it really is Christianity and not Paulianity. And what differences remain between Jesus and Paul are explained both by when their ministry took place and to whom. Jesus preached on the cusp of the old covenant giving way to the new covenant, before his death and resurrection would open the door to salvation for all who believe in him. And Jesus preached almost exclusively to Jews, which is why he encouraged true faithfulness to Torah, in spirit and not just in letter. But Paul preached after the advent of Easter, and predominantly to the Gentiles, which is why, because of Jesus' death and resurrection and what that means for all people everywhere and how we draw near to God, as well as what the Jerusalem Council decides under James's leadership regarding Gentiles being free from the demands of Torah observance, Jesus and Paul, they have some differences in how they preached. But both spoke the same truth about God's good design, about our fall from it into sin, about Jesus' divine identity, about our need for salvation through Christ's atoning work, about God's future world, and the pattern of how, in light of the grace we have received through the gospel, we are now to love God and neighbor. So don't believe the lie that Paul invented Christianity. No doubt he was a brilliant thinker, a keen strategist, and influential apostle. But the true genius of the Christian story, that lies with Jesus and Jesus alone.
Dan here from Questioning Christianity. Thanks so much for checking us out. We are all about helping you connect the Christian story to life's deepest questions. So if you're enjoying the content, make sure